All right, in this video I want to talk about economic systems and outcomes. This kind of piggybacks off of the last section on classifying economic systems, because once we classify an economic system, we then have to have a means through which to evaluate the outcomes of each of those systems. And to understand this better, take a look at the following formula. So we could think of economic outcomes as a function of the system, okay, as defined by its institutions, as a function of the environment, which is the economic resources of the economy, and by a function of its policies, which is government policies that don't alter the whole economic system. When you think about the environment, different places have different resource abundance. For example, a country like Japan is very sparse in its natural resources, and that's going to influence the outcomes that it can achieve, all else equal. Whereas a country like the US has a very eclectic array of natural resources, so that's going to affect our outcomes given that abundant environment. That doesn't mean that Japan and the US can't have similar outcomes. It's just there must be something compensating for any deficiencies. If Japan has an environment that is not conducive to creating good outcomes, then they may have to compensate for that with a different economic system or different policies. And policies themselves, we distinguish as government. Clearly, there's a lot of policies in a society, but government policies are what we're talking about here. And again, it says those that do not alter the economic system. So, for example, if the U.S. were to raise taxes on corporations, well, that would be a change in policy. But that doesn't mean that we went from capitalist to socialist, right? It didn't change our economic system. On the other hand, if we were to implement a 100% tax on all people, that would be not just a change in policy, that would alter our entire economic system, moving us from capitalist to socialist, right? Government decision-making, government ownership of resources, that kind of thing. So it's important to delineate between these two because policies change all the time, but economic systems don't change very often. All right, with that in mind, take a look at this table. When evaluating outcomes, okay, we have to consider all three: policies, environment, and economic system. So imagine these four hypothetical countries with the various economic systems. Looks like there's two different types: natural resources, either rich or poor; refugees, and this is the policy on refugees. So if they have a low number of refugees, that means they have a more rigid policy. If they have a high number of refugees, they have a more relaxed policy. And then outcome, good and bad. So a very simplistic portrayal, but what we're going to highlight here is what's known as the Ceteris Paribus problem. Clearly, countries want to know what factors influence the good and bad outcomes. And by looking at this data, you might be inclined to say, well, we have good outcomes from economic system A, and we have bad outcomes from economic system B. Therefore, economic system A causes good outcomes, and economic system B causes bad outcomes. But that would be a mistake, because you'll also note that economic system A, countries 1 and 2, have rich resources. And economic system B, countries 3 and 4, have poor resources. So it could actually be that it's the rich natural resources causing the good outcomes in the first two countries. And it's the poor natural resources causing the bad outcome in the other two countries. This creates the Ceteris Paribus problem. Ceteris Paribus means all else equal. So if there's a problem, all else is not equal. By trying to connect the economic system to good outcomes and the economic system to bad outcomes, we have a lack of control holding equal natural resources. But let's change that. Let's say that we go out and we collect data and all the countries that we get, 1 through 4, are actually rich. So we can change this to rich, and we can change this to rich. We've now controlled for natural resources, held equal natural resources, and we can more confidently draw a conclusion that type A economic system leads to good outcomes and type B economic system leads to bad outcomes, because the good and bad outcomes can no longer be a result of natural resources. Now, as far as refugees go, it's not correlated with our outcome at all. So we don't need to worry about that. Good outcomes could come from low or high refugees, and bad outcomes could come from low or high refugees. So we only need to control for those variables that are correlated with our outcomes, like natural resource was previously when it said poor and poor. Okay. Now let's talk more specifically about economic outcomes. While there's many outcomes countries may pursue, there are 5 big ones that we're going to start with: standard of living, economic growth, efficiency, equity, and stability. These are not mutually exclusive. For example, economic growth will affect standard of living, and efficiency would affect economic growth, so on and so forth. Okay. The other thing we're going to find out about these economic outcomes is they often involve sacrifices. So if you pursue one outcome, say economic growth, you try to grow a country very rapidly, you may lose equity, okay? You may lose stability. It's no different than for a household. I mean, if a household member pursues higher income in the marketplace, they become a professional, an executive, they work all the time and they're making all this money, they're effectively growing their little economy. That may come at the expense of family time, right? It may come at the expense of relaxing at home. There's always a cost in economics, and that doesn't change with national perspective. Outcomes in one area will mean surrendering outcomes in another area, and those trade-offs have to be considered, which we will do. But let's first look at standard of living. Standard of living is somewhat of a subjective concept. I mean, we can all evaluate it individually. For national standards of living, we usually start with real GDP per capita. That's the total output of the economy divided by the population. And I've just put some examples here for you. This data comes from the CIA Fact Book, which is an excellent source for information. And I've just picked the world's top 10 largest economies. Now, these are the largest economies in real GDP overall. Okay. In other words, this is the pie that the economy produces every year, and specific to 2017 here. But this is not considering each person's slice of the pie. To get that, you have to take the total real GDP and divide it by the population. Okay? So, for example, China has a real GDP total of 23,160 billion, which is effectively $23 trillion a year. Quite a bit larger than the US, which has 19 trillion. But China has a lot more people than the US. And as a result, if you take this pie and you divide it by the number of people in China, you only get $16,700 in average income per capita GDP. Whereas in the US, you take this value and you divide it by the population, you get almost 60,000. So per person, the Chinese have a much lower standard of living than someone in the US. And then you go down the list. India is the 3rd largest economy in the world, okay? But it has a massive population. So when you take this $9.4 trillion in GDP and divide it by the billion or so people, you get $7,200 in average income, per capita income. Okay? Then you get Japan, Germany, Russia, Indonesia, Brazil, and the UK. So largest economies in the world, but vary quite a bit in terms of their standard of living per person. In fact, some countries stand out because they have GDPs that are large, but at the same time, they have very small populations. And here's some examples I just hand-picked. Qatar, Macau, Luxembourg. These are three of the richest countries per person in the world. They're tiny, right? They have very small numbers of people, but at the same time, they're spreading the pie out. They're spreading a large pie out. So in Qatar, 124,000 is the average income, 111,000 in Macau, and in Luxembourg, 102,000. Then you have countries that are very poor. So the Democratic Republic of Congo is, for the most part, the poorest country in the world, with only $800 per person in income. The world average, 17,300, which really puts in perspective the difference between the first world, right? The U.S., Japan, Germany, and France, and these other countries, and the third world, Afghanistan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, even India, where they struggle to meet some basic necessities. Another way of looking at this is through the lens of a map. And it's interesting because you just saw that with the world average of 17,000, the rich countries are really the aberration. The poor countries closer to this level are more normal. In other words, when we think of Mexico, and Mexico is probably 11th or 12th here in terms of global GDP, but when you look at Mexico, from our perspective, it looks like a very poor country. But Mexico is actually a little bit better than average. So they're more typical in terms of world standards of living than the US would be, which is contrast. And that means that the cutoff for standard of living of the richest countries is actually 20,000 on this map. So countries that have more than 20,000 per capita income, it's 2016 data, are green. So you got the US, Canada, right? You've got Argentina, Chile, you've got Russia, and Australia and Western Europe. And no surprise here, right? A lot of countries that are doing better than others. Then you get into the purples here, or maroon, 10 to 20,000. So you get Mexico, you get most of South America, some parts of Africa, and China. And then you get into the blues, which are between 2,500 and 10,000. You start to get more Africa, you get India, parts of Central and South America, and then less than 2,500, the absolute poorest countries in the world, and you almost exclusively get Africa. And that's important to note because Africa is one of the richest continents in terms of resources, but they failed to achieve the kinds of standards of living that other countries have. I mentioned earlier that Japan is a relatively poor country in terms of its natural resources, but it's rich in terms of its standard of living. So Japan has been able to offset the lower natural resources with better economic systems and better policies, creating a very high standard of living. Whereas Africa, or I should say many nations in Africa, have a high level of natural resources, but have not implemented the kind of economic systems and policies that are as conducive to raising the standard of living. Okay? Another thing to consider is the world poverty data. This data comes from the World Bank. The stats here are from 2016, but we do have more recent data to update this. The 2016 data showed that about 10% of the world's population lived off of less than $1.90 per day, which is about $700 a year. That's known as the extreme poverty rate. Okay? That has went down to about 9% in 2020, but is expected to go up as a result of the COVID pandemic. And then the 28% number is the poverty rate for those that live off of less than $3.20 a day. That's less than $1,200 a year. And that has went down as well. That is around 23% as of 2020. But again, that is expected to increase as a result of COVID. Now, as dire as these numbers, or even the most recent data are, global poverty has been dropping dramatically over the decades. If you go back to 1990, this extreme poverty rate was actually close to 36%. So over a third of the world lived in extreme poverty. All right, that's it for this video. I'll pick up with standard of living in the next video. Thanks.